Hello everyone, Dicko here. I have no idea who is watching, and I've never done this before, so hello. Even if you haven't, even if you're not online right now, I'll be posting this online. So hello, my name is Dicko. I'm a 3D artist, and I'm gonna teach you some cool shit about 3D, starting from the very beginning. Um, and there's a lot of misconceptions about 3D, how complicated it is, all kinds of shit like that. Um, yeah, and there's tons of stuff to learn. If anyone is watching, let me know if you're actually hearing me record as well, because I have no idea. Um, so yeah, let's start. So 3D modeling, at least, is quite simple. It's made up of three basic things. That is vertices or verts, edges, and faces. And for most cases, especially with modeling, these are the only three things that are used to build most 3D objects in 3D space. I mean, there are other things, and we'll get into that soon, but these are the basic premises. So, in every 3D software, be it Maya, Blender, Cinema 4D, 3ds Max, you generally are building your objects with these three things. So, a vert is a point in 3D space. As you can see, I am starting from the very basic. An edge is when you connect 2 points as a relationship, which is basically what it says on the tin. It's an edge. And a face is basically when you get three edges connected to form a plane. And that equals a polygon, meaning multiple edges. Now, a polygon can come in the form of three things or more. So it can be a triangle, it can be a square, or it can be an n-gon, which is a polygon with more than four faces. So tris, quads, and n-gons. Pretty straightforward. So they're all connected by the same thing, which is vertices, or points in 3D space. Now, generally when you're animating or creating models for animation, you stick with these two. And you try to avoid these ones. Because these ones, as in the triangle and the squares, they deform better when you're animating them. Now, just to demonstrate, and just to preface this with a few things, it doesn't matter what fucking software you're using to create 3D models. It could be Blender, it could be Maya, it can be Cinema 4D, 3ds Max, whatever you want. The principles are all the same, and to prove that, I have Maya and Blender open at the moment. So here's my model from Blender, and if I turn on my preview, my wireframe preview, you'll see that it's constructed of vertices, edges, and faces. And if I go into my edit mode, you can see I can select the edges and vertices and faces, no worries. It's very easy to select these things once you get used to it. And if I look at the same model in Maya, it looks exactly the same, it behaves the same way, The only thing that's different is the interface. So if I want to select the edges, I can select the edges, as you'd expect. If I want to select the vertices, I can select the vertices. And if I want to select the faces, I can select the faces. And because they both follow the same principles under the hood about how 3D models are generated in 3D space, they look practically identical. So this whole concept of one software being better than the other doesn't really apply when you're talking about simple things like modeling, texturing, and even to some degree animation. All that matters is that you're comfortable with the tools that you work with, and you have fun making things, and you make awesome art. But in this case, we are going to go with Blender because it is free, and it's the most accessible, and I find it to be the most fun to use. So I make my best art using Blender. So, starting with a brand new window from Blender, let's have a look at how that is translated in 3D. So, this is Blender. Pretty simple. You have a viewport, you have your tools on the side, you have an outliner, which is basically a library of all your stuff in your scene. So you can see I have a camera, I have a cube, and I have a light. All this stuff on the side we'll get into soon, but let me just demonstrate how vertices, edges, and faces work from scratch. So let me just demonstrate. So I'm going to create a single vert. And you can see it's highlighted there, absolutely tiny. But if I were to go into my edit mode and extrude out another vert, you can see it's creating an edge. And that doesn't really mean much in 3D space because you can't really render a single edge. But if I start to create another vertice and that's connected, I have 2 edges and 3 vertices. Now look what happens when I fill it completely. So if I connect all 3 verts together to create 3 edges, I get myself a very simple polygon. And I can turn that into a quad as well. So if I just go into my edit mode again, select the edge and subdivide this, and which means basically adding an extra point. I got myself a quad, which is basically a rectangular polygon. And of course, if I want to turn that into an n-gon, I can do the same. And I got myself an n-gon. And basically, as we string together a bunch of faces and a bunch of polygons together, we can start to create 3D objects, cubes, spheres, trees, people, furniture, whatever you like. Under the hood, they're all built in the same way. Now, let's just start with a new file and go through the interface of Blender and how we can create some simple objects. Now, let me just turn on my screencast keys and make sure that's turned on. Sweet. All right. So to navigate Blender, it's a little bit different from your average 3D software. It doesn't really follow the rules, so to speak. But basically, to rotate around your scene, you can hold down the middle mouse button on your mouse and drag it around, and you can rotate around your screen. To zoom in, you can hold down Control, middle mouse button, and drag it as well, and you get a nice clean zoom. And then to pan, which is to move horizontally across the scene, you hold down Shift, middle mouse button, and you can pan around the scene. Now, when you install Blender for the first time, you have a few options. you can opt in to use the right click or the left click to select things. If you want to stay comfortable, just go with the left click, and it's easy to go with. I'm going with right click select because I've got used to it over the years. But basically, to select objects, you just click on your objects as you would anything else in any other software. Just click to select. To manipulate an object, you can either click these buttons here on the side. So in this case, I can click move. I get a little widget, and I can move things around, either on the X, Y, or Z axis. So in 3D space, you have 3 axes. You have X, Y, and Z. In Blender, X is horizontally to left and right. Back and forward is Y, and going up and down is Z. So in other software, Z and Y are flipped, so you have to be conscious of that if you're doing things across different software. But for Blender, we'll just stick with that. Z is up and down, Y is back and forward, X is side to side. Now, you can also rotate an object by clicking on the rotate button. You get the same sort of thing. You can rotate across the Y, you can rotate across the X, and you can rotate across Z. And you can always undo things as well. And of course, finally, you can scale. So you can scale globally by scaling the entire object by clicking on the circle and scaling. You can scale in the Z, or you can scale in the Y, or you can scale in the X. Undo all that. Pretty straightforward. And anything can be moved around in 3D space. So you can move around your camera. You can move around your lights. Anything's possible in Blender. Let me just double check to see if this is transmitting properly. It is. Sweet. I'm seeing the comments, Cornell. There is no best 3D software, but the most fun is Blender. Yeah, so they're all hard to use. They're all hard to use from the start, so it just takes getting used to. Just have fun with it. And anyone who's coming from Maya and says that Blender is hard, I would argue that Maya is just as hard to use. That's just the way it is. If you're learning from the first time, it doesn't matter which software you use. The learning curve is just the same across the board. All right, so how do we actually edit the cube to get into those edges, faces, and vertices? So to do that, Blender has a few modes. So you can operate the cube as a whole in object mode. To get to the vertices, the edges, and the faces, you jump into edit mode by clicking up in this tab here or pushing tab on the keyboard. And as you can see, when I jump into edit mode, everything is highlighted, including the edges, faces, and verts. But I can click on individual edges, verts, and faces, as you'd expect. And then, just like before, I can edit those edges, faces, and verts by clicking on either the move, rotate, or scale button. So just move them around, and I can make crazy shapes. Now, Blender comes with a bunch of different cool tools to manipulate geometry, so you can create new geometry with all these different tools down the bottom here. And once you get used to these tools, you can actually start to use the shortcuts. So in my case, I like to use shortcuts, but I'll show you how to do both. So for instance, if I want to put a square within the square on this top face, I can push the I keyboard shortcut to inset a face, like so, and then I can drag it up, and then I have new geometry. So to do that with the buttons on the side here, there's the actual inset button, inset faces button. I get a little icon to push and pull those across, so I can pull it in, and then I can go to my other tool, my move tool, and pull them out. I can also extrude extra pieces out by pushing E, and then I'll be locked into the axis that it's coming out of. So I can extrude it out like so, and then just confirm that by pushing enter or clicking on my mouse. I can also extrude by using buttons on the side here. So there's an extrude bevel, an extrude region button. Push the button, and then I can extrude out like so. And as you can see, I'm already making some pretty complicated geometry. Now, I can also add extra edges into these objects by pushing the loop cut tool. So if I want to cut these two faces in half and then start manipulating these vertices, I can create an extra edge loop. And as you can see, I can make as many as I want. And then I can manipulate these edges as well and make all kinds of weird shapes. Now 3D, when it comes to modeling, is basically a process of manipulating these three things, edges, faces, and vertices, together to form a object that you want to make, be it a character, an object like a chair, a tree, anything really. So let's just go through the interface as well before we jump into making something for the first time. So to select your edges, vertices, and faces, we have these three buttons up at the top. So once one's highlighted, I can select any one of my vertices. I can select my edges by selecting the edge selection tool, or I can select the faces. Then I have a bunch of things I can do to change the way I view my objects. So there's all kinds of stuff there. I have selection tools. I have a panel to add new objects. I can transform the mesh through the menu here. And then there's context-specific menus for your edges, faces, and vertices. Over here, we have some tools for changing the way that you operate the move tool, rotate tool, and scale tool. We have different operators for how we manipulate the 3D objects in space. We have snapping, so we can snap to the grids, we can snap to other meshes. We have soft select here, so we can use the soft select to select things within a radius, and it can manipulate according to the radius of that selection. And then of course we have mirror tools up the top here as well. In the other viewport settings, we have object visibility settings, so we can select objects or select or hide objects based on their type. So in this case, I can hide my mesh type. I have other options as well, so I can hide my cameras, my lights, or I can make them not selectable. So by clicking on this little arrow, and it turns black, I am no longer able to select my object in object mode. And then I have other options as well. So I have viewport options, so I can turn off and on my navigation. I can turn off my active tools, active object as well, all kinds of stuff. And then we have viewport overlays, so we can turn off the visibility of certain things. So if I want to hide my grid, for instance, I can hide the grid. I can hide these axes. I can do whatever I like with this menu here. Over here is X-ray. So I can see through my objects by clicking on X-ray. And then I have options for the previewing of the objects in 3D space. So I can look at it as a wireframe. And this is really important if we start doing a lot of rigging and manipulating objects through each other. We have solid view, which is basically what the default view looks like. We have a pre-rendered view. So if I have lights and materials and all sorts of stuff, I can get a nice preview of how that looks as a textured object. And then I have rendered preview, which has everything: shadows, light, bounces, everything you like. If you are having trouble selecting the verts, you have to make sure that you select each category. So you can either select the edges, faces, or verts. if you hold down shift, you can select all three actually. So if I hold down and they're all highlighted, 1, 2, 3, I can select either the edges, faces, or the verts in one big hit. And if you like to model that way, you can. So, but I like to keep it individual. Moving on through the interface, we have our outliner, and this becomes super important as we get into more complicated objects. You have multiple things in the scene, and you start building out animations and stuff. But right now we only have a camera, a light, and a cube. Well, it's become this weird thing now, but that's how it is at the moment. And then they're organized in things called collections. And basically they are used to organize your scene in terms of rendering, whether you want things turned off and on, all that sort of stuff. And what I like to do when I set up a new scene, I like to make sure that these buttons are turned on here. So this is a little filter option. Basically, it lets you turn off and on objects. It lets you deselect objects. So I can turn off the cube. I can turn it off as a rendered object, or I can make it not visible in all my viewports. So by turning all these things on, I get a better idea of what's going on in my scene. And down here, we have our properties panel. So our properties panel becomes super important once we start playing with modifiers. We can start playing with our rendering settings, all sorts of stuff. But basically, this is a universal panel for everything to do with Blender. That includes rendering, where you save your rendered files, view layers, which are like render layers, scene information, world information, including the way that it's lit. We have object information. So basically, this object is selected. We have our cube, where it's sitting as a transform, its rotations, its scales, its relationships. So if it's a parent or a child of anything, it sits in here. We have modifiers, so we can actually add non-destructive modeling to this object. We have physics tab and constraints. Here's our physics, sorry. And then we have constraints. And then we have the nitty-gritty stuff. So we have what they call it object data properties. So all the information about vertex groups and more complicated stuff, that's where this information lies. And as we get into more detail as the weeks go on, we'll probably cover this in a lot more detail. Then we have materials. So if we want to add different colors to this object, textures, etc., this is where all that happens here. And then we have textures for like in Blender sort of stuff. So this is less used, but it does become important as we get into more detail in the future. Down the bottom, we have our timeline. So when we start animating our objects, this is where all our keyframes sit. And then we have different windows. So we have different editors in Blender. So starting with our viewport, we have, what you see in 3D space. But then we have other crazy stuff like our image editors. We have UV editors, compositors, shader editors, and so on. So there's all kinds of sections in Blender, but basically, for the most part, you'll be working within the 3D space. You can actually create new windows as well. So to create a new window, we can click up in here in the corner, this little curvy bit, this little gap, it's a little hard to see. You can click it and drag it out, and you can create a duplicate window of what you've got. And if I look in the image editor, I can have my image editor in one window. I can have my 3D viewport in another window. Or if I want to, I can have an orthographic view, front view like so. And then I can have my perspective view like so here. To close a window, we just click on the little line in the middle here, right click, push join areas, and then you can swipe left or right to choose what area you want it to collapse to, and then click to confirm. Now in 3D space, you have perspective view, which is like this view here, but then you also have orthographic view. So to go from perspective view to orthographic view on your numpad on the keyboard, you push 5, and it gives you a flat view with no distortion to view at. And this is great for blocking out rooms, blocking out more technical diagrammic sort of stuff. But otherwise, you'd be normally working within the perspective view. You can also access your different views by pushing on the tilde icon on your keyboard, and you get a little pie chart. And then you can choose which way you want to look at. So I can look at the top, I can look at the front, I can look at the back, left, right, bottom. And then if I want to get out of that view, I just have to push the middle mouse button and rotate out of that view. Pretty simple stuff. So for the next half an hour, let's try and build something together. Just using those very simple tools in Blender. So let's go with something like a table. All right, so I'm going to delete this object. So to delete an object, I'm going to click on X on my keyboard to delete it. And I'm going to make a new object. And this is what brings up the 3D cursor. So this thing here is called the 3D cursor, this little round thing with a checker color on it. And that determines where objects are generated when you make new objects. And that can be moved around throughout the scene. And you might accidentally be moving it around right now whenever you click on the scene. Depending on what selection mode you're working with, if you push shift and click, you'll have it move around. But in my case, it's just left click select and it moves around. To move it back to the 0 point, which is where I want my cube, my new model to be created, I gotta reset it. So to reset that little circle, I go to my little side tab here. You see a few tabs here. In this case, I gotta go to my view tab. And then here in the 3D cursor, I have the option to reset it to 0. So I'm gonna reset that to 0, like so. And now it's back to 0. Now I can add a new object. So to add a new object, I'm going to go to the object panel here, or the add panel, and I can choose mesh and cube, sphere, or anything. Or I can push Shift A on my keyboard and I get a little drop down menu. In your case, it might be pushing right click, and you get a menu like so. And then I add a new cube, a nice fresh new cube. Now let's edit this cube into a table. So we go into edit mode, and now I'm just going to select the top face here. If I select that face and I have my move tool on, I can now shrink that cube. I can bring that face all the way up to make the top of my table. That's pretty cool. Nice and simple. And now if I want to, I can actually duplicate this tabletop part to make the undercarriage of the table. So I can select all by pushing A on the keyboard, and then by pushing Shift D, I can duplicate that. And as you can see, nothing has happened until I move it down and it's made a duplicate. Now I might want to shrink that down to give it a little bit of character. So if I shrink that down by pushing S on the keyboard to scale, I can also use the scale tool here, or pushing S on the keyboard to scale. I can scale that down. Now, how do we make the legs of our table? Well, there's a few ways we can do that, but how about we try doing it with modifiers? So modifiers are basically non-destructive modeling techniques. So basically, if I make one leg, I can duplicate that leg and then duplicate that leg 4 times to create my table. So let's make a new cube. We'll add a new cube, go to cube, and now I need to go into edit mode first and make one leg for my table. So into edit mode. Now let's make our leg. So I might select this side here, bring that down that side over there. I might select this face here and then move that in like so. And then I'm going to select this face, bring that in a little bit further, and so on until I get a single leg. So that looks all right. I'll move that in like so, move that in, and now I'm going to move this leg up until the 0 point of my world. So if I want to see where the 0 point, the ground plane of my world is, I push 1 on the keyboard, and as you can see, the red line indicates where the 0 point, the ground plane of my table will be. So I can select this face on the bottom, bring that up to around there, and I have a single table leg. Now, let's duplicate this leg across each part of the table here. Now, you might be wondering, why don't I just duplicate it by pushing Shift D? Well, the cool thing is, by doing it with modifiers, I can still edit this single leg and it will edit every other leg together. And this is the cool thing about Blender's modifiers. So to do that, I go onto my modify tab, the little screwdriver here, or the little wrench. And as long as my origin point is set to 0, this will work. So if you've been editing your cube out of edit mode but in object mode, make sure you apply the scale, rotation, and the location of your cube. So to do that, go into object mode, select your leg, and then push Control A, and you'll get an apply tab. So basically, if I have here in the transform tabs any sort of location, scale, or rotation edits on those numbers, I can apply them. So to do that, go to apply, so Control A, apply, location, rotation, scale, or you can push apply all transforms. And you will see that this little dot, meaning the origin point of this leg, will go back to 0. So let's add a modifier. In this case, I'm going to add a mirror modifier. So if I push mirror down here in the little wrench, I'm going to click on add modifier, add a mirror modifier, and I'm going to mirror it across the X plane. And automatically I have a duplicate leg exactly where I want it to be in the mirror along the X axis. Now, if I want to mirror it across the Y axis, in this case, this way, I also click the Y axis, and suddenly I have a perfectly symmetrical table. Now check this out. If I go into edit mode and start manipulating those faces, edges, and verts again, it will affect every other leg without me having to do it individually. So let's jump into edit mode. And now I'm going to have this leg selected. As you can see, everything is there. Now I can add a new edge loop by pushing this loop cut tool. And now I can bring that loop cut down. And now if I scale it by holding down the scale button, it's going to affect all the legs at the same time. How cool is that? So now very quickly I can start making a very fancy looking table just by changing the way that I manipulate those verts, edges, and faces. So you can also make a new edge loop by clicking on Control R on the keyboard. So let me just show you how that's done. So Control R, and you'll get a little indication. You can click, and then you can drag it up and down the leg. And this is why shortcuts become very important in Blender. And then I can scale that one down too. Again, I can make another loop. I can scale that up. Another loop, bring that down, scale that down. And you can make some really cool patterns just by playing with your edges. How cool is that? Now imagine I want to turn this into a smooth, round leg instead of these hard edges. Well, I can do that by adding another modifier. In this case, I'm going to add a subdivision modifier. So what a subdivision modifier does, it basically adds geometry for you and smooths it out based on the average distance between your edges, verts, and faces. So to do that, I go to add modifier. I'm going to go down to subdivision surface, and it smooths out the object. And as you can see, if I turn on the wireframe preview, it's creating new geometry for me. And you may notice, oh wait, but the legs at the top look a bit wonky. How do we fix that? Well, we need to actually add some new geometry at the top to give it a sharper curvature at the top. So we go back into our edit mode. We turn off our subdivision surface for now by pushing this little screen button. And I'm going to add an extra edge loop. I'm going to drag it up. And now watch what happens once we add the subdivision surface. It smooths out. And you can keep editing it. Even though the subdivision is turned on, I can keep editing it. And I can keep adding new edge loops as we go. And as you can see, it's staying smooth and nice and consistent. And then we can make some really cool different kinds of furniture just by adding edge loops, scaling them around, moving them around the object. And now we have a fancy table. How cool is that? And that's just by using modifiers. Now, you may be wondering, but this looks really kind of janky. It still looks a bit hard-edged. That's because we need to change it from a hard surface view to a smooth preview view. So to do that, you right-click on the object. In my case, I have to push W on the keyboard because I'm using right-click select. And you get a context menu that asks you to shade smooth. Make sure you're in edit mode when you do this, and you'll get this option. If I push shade smooth, the object basically smooths out. And that's basically the gist of modeling in Blender. Playing with edges, vertices, and faces, using your move, scale, and rotation tools, and then playing with your modifiers to get different results. Let's see how the chat's going. Nice one, Cornell. Right click is a sin. But not for me, I'm used to it. I like it. But you can use left click. So, how about we try something else? Let's try and make something that isn't symmetrical, like a tree. So, I don't want to delete this thing, but I might want to use it later. Maybe I want to put a tree in a pot on top of the table. So in this case, let's hide this object for now by pushing on these buttons here. So we can hide the objects by clicking shift select. You can select multiple objects, and to hide them, push H on the keyboard or push on the eye icon in the outliner. So in this case, I'm going to hide both. 1, 2. Now let's make a tree, a very simple tree. So again, let's go to our object. We're going to add a new mesh. In this case, I'm going to add a cylinder. And you get a cylinder like so. Now, when you are edit objects for the first time after you create them, you get a little box down here for adding extra parameters. So in this case, it's asking me when I create this cylinder, how many vertices I want, how wide I want the radius of the cylinder to be, and how deep I want that cylinder to be, and whether I want to cap fill the object. So in this case, it's capping it, it's filling in the top and bottom with an n-gon. And for now, I don't want that, so I can turn that off. I can put nothing, so it's hollow. I can change the radius so it's thinner to match my tree that I want. And then I can make its depth even smaller as well. So I'm going to make that depth smaller. And then I might make the location sit a bit higher up. In this case, I'm going to have it sit up on the Z at around 0.5 meters. Once I'm happy with that, I can confirm it by just clicking off it. And now that's confirmed. Now, how do we turn this into a tree? Well, let's start with the trunk. So a tree starts out thick and then gets wider at the bottom. Gets wider at the bottom, then goes thinner at the top. So I'm going to make the top ring smaller. So let's select these edges here. And you might be wondering, I don't want to have to select each edge individually. Well, you don't have to. If we click on one edge, hold down the Alt key on your keyboard, and then click it again, you can select the entire ring of edges. And then we can scale down our tree, so we get something closer to a cone. Now, let's make it look a bit more like a tree. Let's add a few more edge loops. So I'm going to use the edge loop tool again. I'm going to push Control R. I'll get the little icon again, and then I'm going to drag it down to the bottom. And then I'm going to scale that down by pushing S on the keyboard. I might add a few more. S. Scale that down. And then scale that down. All right. So we have our trunk ready. How about the rest of the tree? Well, let's try and add some branches first, and we'll cap off this top as well. So let's cap off the top by adding some triangles. So we're going to select the entire circle. We're going to extrude another circle inside. So let's use the extrude tool. Extrude region. We click on that button. We get the little plus icon, and we can extrude a new region out. And now let's scale that in. So we have a little cap, and now we need to fill in that cap. So we can do that in a few ways, but in this case, I'm going to merge these edges into a single vertice, and these will turn into triangles at the top. So to merge an object, a bunch of vertices, we push Control M. Oh, sorry, not Control M. We push Alt M, and you get an option to merge in different ways. So in our case, we need to merge at center. So we push merge at center, and now our tree has been filled in at the top. And now we can just edit our other circle to get something a little bit more clean, and we can add a few more edge loops. All right, so let's add some branches. So we can do it in a few ways. We can actually duplicate this and then turn these into branches. So we can actually duplicate this object like so, and then scale it down and turn those into branches. Or we can manipulate this model to create branches out of the tree directly. So let's do that. So by the way, to delete an object, so if I had to copy this object, I can delete an object by pushing X on the keyboard. I get an option to delete, and then I can push delete. Otherwise, if I want to delete an object directly, I just push delete on the keyboard, and it works as well. So let's create some branches. Now, I need to create a branch here. Let's create a branch. So I'm going to select some faces, like so. And then I'm going to use the extrude tool to extrude out some branches, like so. Oops. And then I can manipulate that by pushing G or R on the keyboard, and I can manipulate it by moving them around like so. Then I can scale that down. And then if I want to, I can add another edge loop here to have some extra geometry going down the branch. And then if I want to smooth out this thing to be rounder, I can click on these edges. So Alt clicking on those edges each way, like so. And then I can use the smooth tool. So the smooth tool averages out our branch, so it gets into a more smoother transition to the branch. So that's not working too well right now because we haven't got enough geometry here. So it's trying to average out the distance between these edges and this edge is up here. So we need to add an extra edge here. So let's add an extra edge loop, Alt R or Control R. And then we can smooth out this object. And then we can smooth out these edges again. And if we pull that again, you can see we're getting a nice smoother transition there. So what happens if we add a modifier to this tree? We want to subdivide it perhaps. So easy enough. We just go to subdivision surface, and we can smooth out that edge. Pretty cool. Let's add one more branch and then add some leaves, which is just going to be like a little sphere. So to do that, we're going to create another set of edge loops. I'm going to choose just a random assortment of faces. And then I'm going to extrude out using the extrude region button again. As you can see, it looks a bit wonky because I've got subdivide turned on. I can turn that off if I want to, or I can just add a new edge loop there. And then I can smooth that out like so. I can select the faces that I want to be smoothed out as well up here. Smooth those out. And then I can scale that down. And I got myself another branch. And then I'll just rotate those using the rotation tool. Rotate those out again. Smooth it up. Whoops. Smooth that out. And we got a basic tree with some branches. Now let's add some very simple leaves using spheres. So to add a sphere, I'm going to make sure that my view is set to 0 again on the 3D cursor. New sphere. In this case, you just go to Shift A, Mesh, New Sphere, UV sphere. Scale that down. And we got ourselves a pretty nice basic tree. And I can squish down that, And I can squish down that sphere by pushing down S on the keyboard, then Z to lock in the Z axis and scale that down. And then I might duplicate that by pushing Shift D. I can scale that up like so. And I can place it over the other tree top. And then again, once more, duplicate that, Shift D, and then move that into place like so. And there we have it, a very simple basic tree. Now, what if I want to move this tree around, but the leaves aren't following the tree trunk? Well, we can actually parent these leaves to this tree trunk, or we can create an object that we can control the entire tree in its entirety. So to do that, I'm going to create an empty. In other software, this might be called a null or a locator, but in this case, in Blender, it's called an empty. So to create an empty, so an empty is basically a container with no real geometric information. It's basically a container for your objects. So to create an empty, go to Shift A, scroll down to empty, and then in this case, I'm going to create a cube, an empty cube, like so. And now I can select these four objects. So by shift selecting, so shift select your four objects if you have that many, and then finally select the empty last. And then if we push Control P on the keyboard for parenting, these objects will become a child of this empty. So now if I select this empty and move it around, I can move the tree around as well. Now let's place this tree on top of our table. So by bringing back the view of the table, let's click on the little eye icon, bring back the view of our table. Let's select our empty and then bring that up on the table. And now the cool thing is, if we scale this down, we can make the tree smaller. We can bend it using the rotation tool if you want to. We can make it a little bit more asymmetrical, but in this case, I'm just going to keep it as that. Now let's add a pot for this tree to sit in. So let's go into front view. Let's ignore that for now. We're going to just extrude out a new pot by doing it a different way. Let's make a new cylinder. We're going to make it wider, increase the radius. We're going to go to edit mode. We're going to bring down this bottom layer of verts up. We're going to create a new edge loop here, and then we're going to create a pot like so. And then we can add a modifier to thicken this up actually, but first we need to fill in the bottom here. So let's fill in the bottom of the pot by clicking on our edge loop in the bottom, and we can fill it in by selecting Control F on the keyboard, and then we can say fill, and that will fill it in a really dirty way. So instead of doing that, let's go to F for fill, and then we can go into grid fill, and that will fill it in as a grid as well. But that's still not perfect, so let's fill it in with some triangles. So in this case, I'm going to extrude in face, like so, and then I'm going to scale that down, and then I'm going to merge it. So in this case, I'm going to merge the center by pushing Control M or Alt M, merge the center, and then I'm going to bring that vertex up to 0 on the Z. So now we have our basic pot. Let's add some thickness to this pot by adding modifiers. So to add some thickness, we can use the solidify tool. And as you can see, it's actually added some thickness to that mesh. It's actually duplicating the mesh and then adding thickness by filling it in. Now we can smooth that out by adding a subdivision modifier. And now we have a nice smooth pot. And we can smooth out the visualization of that by pushing on right click or W in object mode, shade smooth. And now we have a smooth pot. Now let's bring back everything that we will be making before. We can do that by pushing Alt H, and that will bring back everything that we've created so far. All we're going to do now is bring up that pot, and we can scale that down, and we basically have a table, a tree, and a pot. And that's all just using the same vertices, edges, and faces that we talked about from the beginning of the tutorial. So if anyone's still watching, yeah, I know what I mean. But we'll get into that lofting later on. But yes, I got a suggestion here to bevel the table. So to bevel the table, beveling is basically adding chamfers to the edges of things. So we can do that by using modifiers or hard modeling that in. So in this case, I'm going to bevel the top of the table by using a modifier. So to do that, I select the top of my table and add a bevel. And look at that. Straight away, I have some pretty cool beveling going on, and I can actually add and remove things depending on the operator. So I can add more segments. So if I show you what's going on with the wireframe. So what modifiers do, it just generates new geometry based on what you've already built. So I can add a new bevel modifier. And then if I change the offset, it changes the way that the bevel works. So in this case, I can hold down Shift and gradually make it thicker or thinner. I can add segments, so I can make it a rounder bevel. Or I can even change the way that the profile works as I build it. So in this case, if I add even more edge loops, so lots and lots, and then go into the profile settings, I can actually change the profile with a custom profile and get some really crazy things. So I can actually create a really weird and wonderful profile just by changing the curve. And as you can see, if I turn off the wireframe, it's giving me really weird patterns for my profile. And that's all just by changing and adding vertices, edges, and faces with a procedural workflow. But I can also turn that off and just have a basic profile as well. So I can reduce my segments down to 3 and have a nice smooth profile. And then all I gotta do is smooth out that preview and we're good to go. And there we have it, a table with a tree on a pot, all within an hour. Hopefully you've learned a lot from this lesson. I'm going to leave it at that because we're reaching an hour at this point. Next week, I'm not sure what we'll cover, but we'll cover more to do with the eccentricities of Blender. We'll model some other cool stuff, maybe a cup and some other things to go on this table. And then we'll maybe get into rendering and some materials. So until then, I think we'll call it quits. All right. Thanks guys for coming. I really appreciate it. I've seen some names that I know, but others names that I don't know. So that's good to see as well. Yeah, every Monday, 1:30, let's make some cool shit. All right. We'll see you later.